In today's video, we're going to quickly create this particular dystopian sci-fi environment loop. It's going to be using geometry nodes, so let's begin the tutorial. In our default scene, we're going to bring our cursor to the junction of these two windows and click and drag to open a new window and change this from the 3D viewport to the geometry node editor. Then we can press this plus icon to create a new geometry node tree and just zoom in. Now we can delete our default cube by selecting the group input and tapping X to delete it. Then we can press Shift A and search for a grid node, which is going to be the basis for our entire environment. We can plug the mesh into the group output, and there we have the grid. Now we want it to be much larger, so we're going to increase the size of the X and Y to something like 10 units, and that way we get a large grid. Now we need to distribute some points on this grid, so we'll press Shift A and search for a distribute points on faces node and just plug that in and change it from random to poise on disk and change the minimum distance to something like 0.1 initially. We might change that later on. Now we'll press Shift A and search for an instance on points node so that we can actually instance something onto each of those points. For this particular tutorial, we're going to be using cylinders because in previous tutorials, such as the one that's linked on the top right corner right now, we used cubes, and you should definitely check that out. Similarly, you could check out this video as well. Now we can press Shift A and search for cylinder and plug the mesh into the instance, and that way we get a bunch of cylinders instance on each of the points. Now obviously we don't want them to be this large, but we'll change that in a second. However, the first thing that we need to cater to is the actual resolution. It's very blocky, so we'll increase the vertices all the way up to 128, and you can go even higher if your PC allows it to. So I'll go with 256 to make them really smooth. Once we have that set, we can go ahead and play around with the scale. Now we want it to scale randomly on the X, Y, and Z axes, but for the top to remain circular and not elliptical, we have to make sure that the X and Y are changed by the same value. So to do that, we'll press Shift A and search for a combine XYZ node and plug that into the scale. However, for the X and the Y, we're going to press Shift A and search for a random value node, and we're going to just plug this into both the X and the Y. That way, the circles will remain the same size on the X and Y, but I'll decrease the min to 0.1 and I'll decrease the max to maybe 0.2 or 0.5. So now we have the cylinders. We can go ahead and play with the Z value. So we'll take this random value node, press Shift D, and then plug this right into the Z, but we don't want it such that the fatter ones are the taller ones, which is exactly how it is right now. The fatter it is, the taller it is, the thinner it is, the smaller it is. So to change that, all we need to do is play around with the seed, and now it's going to become random again. Once you have that set, if you like it, you can go on to the next step. Otherwise, you can play around with the actual distribution by playing around with the distance min and things like that. I'll actually decrease the distance min or increase it to 0.3, and that should be all right for my effect. Now, just to organize things better, I'm going to take the grid, bring it out because we're going to use the grid for everything. Take all of these, select them, and press Ctrl J to add a frame. I'll go to the node menu over here. If this menu isn't there, you can tap N to bring it out and change the label to floor. Now to add in all of the other parts like the ceiling and the rest of the objects, we can join them into this particular tree by pressing Shift A and searching for the join geometry node and plugging that in right here. Next up, to create the ceiling, we're going to use the same method that we've used in the previous videos as well by pressing Shift A and searching for a transform geometry node or a set position node. They both would work because these are instances at the moment, and we can plug this into the geometry and take this and plug it into the joint geometry. Now, if you play around with the actual Z offset, we can get the ceiling. So we'll give it a value of maybe 2 units, and that becomes our ceiling. Of course, it's going to be perfectly corresponding to the bottom now. So the fatter ones are going to have fatter circles on top, and the thinner ones are going to have thinner circles on top. In case you don't want that, you can just press Shift A and search for a rotate instances node, plug that in here, switch off the local space button, and then rotate it on the Z by 180 degrees. And that way, there's no longer going to be any resemblance between the top and the bottom. It's going to be completely random. So after that, we can again just select these two nodes, press Ctrl J, and label it as ceiling. Now it's best to keep everything organized like this because these files will be available on Patreon. So in case anybody is playing around with them from there, you'll know exactly which section is responsible for what objects. Now we can go ahead and add in these cylindrical lines that were acting as lights to make it have that dystopian feel. So we'll press Shift A and search for another instance on points node and plug the grid directly into the points, but we need to distribute points on faces before that. So we'll press Shift A and search for a distribute points on faces node, plug that in here. Alternatively, you could have just increased the number of vertices here as well, but I think we'll leave it as this for now. And now you can instance another new cylinder over here. So we'll just position everything better. And for this cylinder, we're going to reduce the vertices to maybe 12 because they're going to be really thin and we don't need it to be too high poly. You can reduce it even lower to 6 as well. The radius you can decrease to 0.01, and we need it to be present on not all the points, but just a few points here and there. So we can use the selection button. Before that, we'll first plug this into the instance so that we can see all of them. And to see them, we also have to take this instance and plug it into the join geometry node. And now you can actually see all of the cylinders. So we'll go ahead and press Shift A and search for a random value node, switch it from float to Boolean so that you get true or false outputs, and just place it here and plug the value into the selection. Now you can decrease the probability till you get a number that you want. So I'll go with 0.05, and there you just have a few of these present. Next, we have to play around with their rotation and their position. We have to lift them up by 1 unit and also rotate them around. Along with that, I'm just going to decrease the depth to something like 4. It's actually increasing it to 4 so that after rotation, it's never going to be a situation where the line doesn't reach the ceiling or reach the floor and it seems like it's floating. So the first thing is the actual rotation. So we'll press Shift A and search for a random value node again. This time we're going to change it from float to vector so that it rotates on all 3 of the axes randomly. I'm going to change the min to minus 0.05 and I'm going to increase the max to plus 0.05. Remember, this is using radians, so then plug that into the rotation. Maybe I can just increase those minus 0.5 and plus 0.5. So once you have that, press Shift A and search for a set position node, plug that in after the instance on point and increase the Z to 1 unit so that it becomes in the center of these 2 objects. Once you have that, you may want to play around with this probability to get the actual number that you want present in your scene. I actually want it to be slightly lesser, so I'm going to go with 0.03. Now I'm happy with the number of lines that there are. I can go ahead and select all of these, press Ctrl J, and I'm going to call these as cylindrical lights. And then I'm going to move on with the next section. So the next part is actually creating these circular lights that are going to be present on top, which are also going to be blinking. And in fact, these cylindrical lights can blink as well. So I'll teach you how to do both of that. First up, again, press Shift A and search for a distribute points on faces node. Take this grid and just plug it into the distribute points on faces. Now we need to actually instance these circles on it. So let's search for an instance on points node, plug the points into the points. And for the instance, this time we're going to search for a circle. So we can just search for a mesh circle, change the fill type from none to n-gon, and then plug this mesh into the instance. Along with that, I'm going to increase the vertices all the way to 128, and the scale has to be randomized. So we'll press Shift A and search for a random value node, plug that into the scale, and I'm going to have the min as 0.1 and the max as 0.3 initially. We might change these around after we see how large it is by taking this instance and plugging it into the join geometry node. So once you plug it in, you can actually see where these lights are. They're firstly way too low, so we have to lift them up. So we'll press Shift A and search for a set position node, plug it in here and just increase the Z value till they come up. Now, just like the previous one, we don't want all of them to be lit. We just need a few of them to be present. So we have to play around with the selection. So we'll press Shift A and search for another random value node, change it from float to Boolean, decrease the probability to 0.01, and then plug the value into the selection. Now start playing with the probability and increasing it till you get a nice number of these lights. So I'll go with a value of 0.05 or 0.075. Next, we have to play with the materials for all of these. So before that, we'll just select these, Ctrl J, call these circular lights. Now, first up, for the floor, we need to add in a material. So let's press Shift A and search for a set material node. Plug that in right after this instance on points. We'll give it the default material, and to add in the other materials, we'll go to the materials panel over here, press plus and add in a new material. First, we'll change the default material name to floor. Then we'll change this material 001 to ceiling, and then we'll add in another slot new. We'll call this lights on, which is going to be all the lights that will be on at all points of time. Then we'll press the plus, add in a new material, which we're going to call lights blink 1, and then we'll press the plus to add in a new material slot, but we'll give it the material after we actually complete lights blink 1, because it's just going to be a copy of lights blink 1. with a few changes. So next up, for this material on the floor, we want only the top surface to get the floor material, and we want the sides to get the same material that the ceiling is going to get. So all of the ceiling is going to get that material, and only the sides of the floor is going to get that ceiling material. So we'll take the set material, we'll press Shift D and plug it behind here, and of course just move everything. And now for the first set material, we'll change it from floor to ceiling. And for the floor, we can use this selection, and it's going to be the top of the cylinder. So from the cylinder, take the top and plug that into the selection. And that way, only the top is going to get the floor material. Now the ceiling has to get the ceiling material. So instead of plugging the geometry from the instance on points, we'll take it from the set material node here. And now the ceiling also has the ceiling material added into it. Next up, for the cylindrical lights and the lights, we'll add in lights on initially, and we'll add in lights blink and all of that after we actually finish the material. So let's search for set material, plug that in right there, change it to lights on, and do the same over here. Shift A, set material, lights on. Now we'll set all of our defaults before we actually start the texturing. So we'll go to our render properties, switch on ambient occlusion, bloom, screen space reflections. Then we'll go to our output properties, change the frame rate to 30 frames per second. End frame is going to be 300 to make it a 10-second long animation. Output folder can be wherever you want it to be. File format is going to be FFmpeg video. And the encoding has to have a container of MPEG-4 with an output quality of perceptually lossless. Then we can change our viewport display from solid to rendered, and we can go to the world and just change our color of the background all the way to 0. And then we can also select the light over here and press delete to remove it altogether. Then we'll start off with the lights on material. So let's select the geometry node object, switch this window from geometry nodes to the shader editor, go down to the slots, and first select lights on. Press period on your numpad to centralize the nodes, and just select the principled BSDF and delete it. Then press Shift A and search for an emission node. Now you can take this emission, plug it into the surface, and just increase the strength to something like 5. You can also switch off overlays by toggling this button up here. That way we'll be able to see what we're doing with the floor and everything. So next we can actually select ceiling. This can remain as the principled BSDF, increase the metallic value to 0.9 and reduce the roughness to 0.4. And that's all I want from the ceiling. From the floor, however, I'm going to press Shift A and search for a Voronoi texture and duplicate it by pressing Shift D, plug the distance into the vector of the second Voronoi texture, and then take these two, press Shift A and search for a color ramp so that we have better control. Plug this distance into the factor, and this output can go directly into the roughness. We can also Control Shift click the color ramp to actually see what it currently looks like, and that's not at all what we want. So we'll play around with the scale and also play around with the color ramp. So right now, this is what it looks like. So we'll just decrease the scale to maybe 3 or 4 and increase the scale to maybe 10. And I'll bring the randomness down to 0.5 on the first Voronoi texture, and I'll keep the scale at 1.8. These numbers can vary based on what your scene looks like and what you desire. So have fun playing around with it. After that, I'm going to bring the black back a bit, bring the white in, bring the black in just a little bit. Change the black from a black value of 0 to a value of 0.3. And change the white from a value of 1 to a value of 0.6. Then you can Control Shift click the principled BSDF to actually see what it looks like. And you just increase the metallicness and maybe decrease this value from 0.3 to 0.1. Reduce this as well from 0.6 to 0.3. So that seems about right. Although again, you can play around with these values and just play around with the color ramp till you get what you like. So once you're happy with that, you can also go in the principled BSDF and just give the base color a complete white and a slightly bluish hue. Again, all of this is your personal preference. I think this slight bluish hue adds to the effect, so I'm going to go with that. Similarly, on the ceiling as well, I'm just going to change the color all the way to the brightest white and just add the tiniest hint of blue. Once you're done with that, we have to actually start with the lights blinks. So the way we do that is delete the principled BSDF, press Shift A and search for an emission node. We can increase the strength to 10, plug that into the surface, and then we can press Shift D to duplicate the emission node, but this time change the color all the way to black so that it's essentially emitting nothing. Then press Shift A and search for a mix shader, plug that in here. And of course, if you don't want the black rim to be seen as a light being switched off and you want it to be completely transparent, instead of the emission node here, you can press X and search for a transparent BSDF. And I think I'm going to use that for this particular animation. Plug that in here. But for it to actually become transparent, you have to go down to the settings in the material properties over here and change the blend mode from opaque to alpha clip. So that way it'll either be emissive or transparent. If you want it to have values in between, you can change it to alpha blend as well. Maybe I'll keep it as alpha blend for today. Next, we have to be able to change between the emission and the transparent BSDFs. To do that, we can use the factor, and if the factor is 0, it's going to be the emission, and if the factor is 1, it's going to be transparent. So we'll just keep the factor at 0.5 for now, and then press I while hovering over the mix shader. And that way, when you actually select it, you can see a keyframe appears in the timeline. We can expand the timeline and change it from the timeline to the graph editor. In the graph editor, again, with that particular node selected or keyframe selected, we can go to the modifier properties over here and add in a noise modifier. And that way we get this noise. What we'll do is we'll increase the strength so that it becomes really high. It crosses the value of 1 and crosses the value of -1. Doesn't have to be 17 though, it can be something like 10. And then we'll just increase the scale so that it's not that sharp. So I'm going to go with a scale of 9. And right now it's very smooth. We don't want it to be smooth. We want it to be either on or off. So to do that, we can add in another modifier, which is going to be the stepped interpolation modifier. That way it just becomes steps, and you can play around with the step size because right now it's still very smooth and you get multiple of these steps. So you can just play around with the step size, and that way you'll get lesser steps and it'll either be on or off. So I'll go with a step size of 5. So that seems all right. I have to make sure that there's enough of it under 0 as well, and I think this is okay. You can always play around with the offset, but I'll keep it as is for now. If you want to actually move it a little lower, you can do that just by grabbing it on the y-axis by hitting GY and bring it to somewhere where you feel like there's balance. However, once you have this, you can actually go up here and for this last slot, select lights blink 1 and then press this duplicate button so that it becomes its own material and change the name to lights blinks 2. And now with lights blink 2 selected, select the mix shader and you can actually expand this over here. Now you can see what this looks like. Here you can just play around with the phase, and that way you get another variation of lights which are going to blink differently compared to the first one. And what that does is give it a more random feel, and it's not like all the lights go off and all the lights go on, and a few of them are going off and on randomly. Now we actually have to make these be like that. So we'll switch this back to the geometry node editor, and first we'll do it for our cylindrical lights. So under the cylindrical lights, for this set material, again, we can press Shift D, plug it in here, and for lights on, we can change it to lights blinks 1, and then press Shift A and search for a random value node. Change it to Boolean again, plug that into the selection, and now we have some of these undergoing this particular stepped interpolation. However, we can't quite give random one of these this particular material because we haven't actually realized them as individual objects. So we have to just shift this to the side, press Shift A and search for a realize instance node, and that way they become their individual objects, and now certain ones are going to actually use lights blinks. Now, if you actually see the factor value, it's never crossing a value of 1, which is why it's never really switching off. So if we increase the probability and play around with it, you can get the number of lines that actually go off and on to keep changing. And that's all right. We now have a few lights here switching off and on. I'll increase the probability because I see only one light over here actually switching on and off. So I'll increase the probability to maybe 0.75. I've gone with the value of 0.8 as of now. Then I can take this set material, press Shift D, add in another duplicate of it. And this time, instead of lights blink 1, I'm going to choose lights blink 2. And again, duplicate the random value node. So press Shift D and plug this into the selection and just change the seed to something random. And then you'll get 2 different sets of lights blinking on and off. But again, this time I feel like the probability is way too high, so decrease the probability to maybe 0.4, and there you have the lights switching on and off. Now, I don't think I actually want this for the cylinders. I want the cylinders to stay on at all points of time, so I'm actually going to mute these nodes, but I'm going to do the exact same thing for the circular lights on the ceiling. So I can just take these, press Shift D to duplicate them, and press Ctrl J so that they become their own frame and come out of that frame. Then just bring it here, just select the frame and press Delete to delete the frame, then select them, plug it into this particular frame, bring it here, and now plug this in to the geometry, plug this into the join geometry, but we have to unplug the one where it's always on. So if you have node wrangler switched on, you can press Ctrl and right click just to cut out the node that was connected from this set material. Then you can press M to just unmute these nodes and play around with the probability. And again, you have to realize instances. So just press Shift A and search for a realize instance node, plug that in here and play the animation so that you get random ones switching on and off. Of course, play around with the probability. Maybe I'll go with 0.4 on both of them to just get it. Along with that, for the world, I can change this from the geometry node section back to the shader editor. But before I do that, I also don't need to realize these instances. So I'm going to mute them as well. So now we just have the ceiling lights blinking and I can play around with the world settings now. So I'm going to change this from the geometry node editor back to the shader editor and change it from object to world. Press period to centralize the nodes. Press Shift A and search for a volume scatter node. Plug that into the volume and decrease the density to 0.01 and increase the color all the way to white for now. You can play around with the density in a while. Now I'll keep it at 0.05. Then I'll just switch on overlay so that I can see everything again. Take this particular object, press Alt-D X to move it to the left by 10 units. Then take it again, press Alt-D X and move it to the right by 10 units again. Then shift select all of them, press Alt-D Y by 10 units. So just type in 10 and then press Shift R to repeat it one more time. Finally, you can start off with the actual animation. So let's take the camera by selecting it either from the 3D viewport or the outliner over here. Press Alt-G to clear location, Alt-R to clear rotation, RX90 to make it look forward, and then just grab it on the y-axis by -5 units so that it comes to the start of our entire scene, and then just grab it on the z-axis by 1 unit. Then you can press 0 to go into the camera view and you can actually see what we see. In the camera properties, I'm going to decrease the focal length to 25 and I'm going to go down to viewport display and increase passport out all the way to 1. Then I'm going to just grab it on the x-axis by -5 units and then go to frame 0 and press I location, then go to frame 300 and then say GX10 because each block was a 10 by 10 grid. So we moved it to one edge. To go to the other edge, it should be 10 units. So we can press I location and then over here, press A to select all of the keyframes, press T linear to make it linear. And that way we will get a seamless looping animation. Of course, it's going to be lagging a bit. So you can change that by changing back to the timeline and changing the playback to frame dropping. And that way you'll get a realistic idea of how fast the camera is actually moving. You can see the lights blinking and things like that if you like it. Similarly, you can play around with the density to hide the things at the back. So I'll increase the density to 0.1. And also I think there's way too many cylindrical lights. So go back to the geometry node editor, select the geometry node object, and just for the probability for the cylindrical lights, decrease the probability, maybe 0.01. And that way the number reduces drastically. And I think that just looks a lot better. Now, finally, just before rendering out the animation, I'm going to go back to my render properties, go to color management, change the look from none to very high contrast. And I'm going to actually increase the exposure to 1 just to make it a little brighter, as well as the gamma to 1.2. Now, you may play with this as you please to get different results. So I might make a few changes just before rendering out the animation, and that's the file that will be available on Patreon. So with that, the final render looks like this. I hope this was useful and informative in some way or the other, and you can find creative ways to implement this particular loop or the things you learned in this particular loop. I have videos being released every single day, so be sure to check out other videos that you may have missed because there's always something to learn from them. Until the next video comes out, keep creating, stay creative, and I'll see you in the next one.